Welcome to this addendum to Daniel chapter 7. This subject of interpreting prophecy is really somewhat dear to my heart. The more that I've looked into the prophecies of the Old Testament and listened to what some scholars, religious scholars in the world say about those prophecies, the more amazed I am at how God presents in such beautiful language that really it paints pictures for the readers. He presents this and we just totally miss the point because we're trying to make every little detail in the picture come out and say what we wanted to say. So I'm going to give you, I don't know, about 6 or 7 examples of Old Testament prophecies and how they offer a picture with language that we could take to an extreme, but surely we know better than to do that. And in some cases we do know better, but then in other cases we look at the prophecy and we want it to literally mean exactly what has been depicted in it. And so we say, well, it hasn't been fulfilled yet, and we're still waiting for a fulfillment. I want to begin in the book of Isaiah. In fact, 2 or 3 other prophecies that I'm going to look at will be in the book of Isaiah as well. Isaiah is a book that's very graphic in its descriptions of what God would actually do at various times in Israel's history and in bringing the Messiah and his kingdom into the world. I want to begin here in Isaiah chapter 29 in verse 6. So if you'll turn to Isaiah 29 and verse 6, we have an interesting description here where we have the Lord of hosts describing what's going to happen. And listen to it. From the Lord of hosts, you will be punished with thunder and earthquake and loud noise, with whirlwind and tempest and the flame of a consuming fire. Wow, that's a lot going on in that verse. And I want you to, thunder and earthquake, loud noise, whirlwind and tempest, the flame of a consuming fire. And we think, what in the world is going to happen to fulfill that? That is fulfilled by the Assyrians. When the Assyrians come and they take God's people and they destroy and they take captive, but why does he describe it this way? Because it's turmoil, it's destruction, it's power. And that's being depicted by these things. Now people read a passage like this in a prophecy, and some of the times, and this is done even by scholars, you know, you've got PhDs out there writing books, and they try to find things in the Bible, and they take a passage like this and they say, well, if you don't literally have thunder and earthquake, loud noise, you don't have a tornado and a tempest, you don't have flames leaping up, then it hasn't been fulfilled. You're missing the point. The point is power, confusion, the sweeping away. And what these prophetic pictures, I want you to notice as we look at each of these, what these prophetic pictures do is they present everything in such a way that these readers, 50 years, 100 years, 600 years before the fulfillment, they can actually feel it before it happens. They can smell it. They can hear it. The ground is trembling with fear as they contemplate their future in a situation like this. The message is the Assyrians are coming. Now another prophecy, it's in Joel chapter 2, but I'm going to go to Acts chapter 2 and simply use what Peter quotes from Joel 2 instead of jumping back and forth. But here in Acts chapter 2, we have a presentation by the Apostle Peter to explain what's going on that day. And that's why we have him saying in verse 16, this is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. Okay, so what he's saying is Joel prophesied of this. This is what Joel was talking about. And so in verse 17, it shall be in the last days that I will pour forth of my Spirit upon all mankind, on your sons and your daughters they shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, old men shall dream dreams, even on my bondslaves. But then we come down to verse 19. And I will grant wonders in the sky above, signs on the earth beneath, blood, fire, vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come. Okay, well, is all of that really happening on this day? And some people say, well, no, that we didn't have these things happening on the day of Pentecost. Blood and fire, vapor of smoke, the sun turned to darkness. You can go back to the crucifixion, but that's not what this is right here. And so someone says, well, there must be something else that's going to be fulfilled in the future. No. Don't miss the point. These are earth-shattering events. So why not describe the earth as shattering? These are things that you need to smell and hear and taste and touch before they happen. And the prophets brought all of these things to life in a language that was so vivid. And then we sit back and we make it mundane. We say, well, there's going to be an earthquake. Well, there's nothing that can compare with what had just happened there in Acts 2 on that day of Pentecost as the Lord poured out the Holy Spirit. There is nothing that could compare with that. But the earth-shattering nature of it is described in this beautiful descriptive language. Now I want you to go back to Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 34, we have another prophecy here in verse 4. Isaiah 34 in verse 4, and while we're reading this, I want you to understand that the prophecy is against the evil nations. And we're not talking about the end of the world here. We're simply talking about the evil nations of Isaiah's day. What is God going to do about the evil nations? Verse 4, all the host of heaven will wear away, the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, all their host will also wither away, as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. And he goes on in verse 5 to talk about his sword satiated in heaven. In other words, it's filled with blood, which he describes in verse 6. He names Edom there in verse 5. The point is not the end of the world. The point in this rolling up of the sky like a scroll of what looks like the end of the world is actually the end of their world. It's the end of those evil nations' world. And you're supposed to be able to see and feel that. It's the poetry of prophecy. A lot of people don't realize that's actually poetry. That's Hebrew poetry. They look at that and they say, wait a minute, that doesn't rhyme. No, it doesn't rhyme. It's better than rhyme. And if you understand the parallelism, all of the beautiful imagery of Old Testament poetry, you would realize that rhyme is not the power of a truly great poem. Hebrew poetry didn't rhyme unless it was making a play on words. Hebrew poetry actually used the phrases to parallel, to build upon, to create contrast. Hebrew poetry was magnificent. And that's exactly what we have going on here in this text. Turn a few chapters later to Isaiah chapter 49. In Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 13, I love this description here. This is a description of the return from captivity. How would you describe the captives coming back from Babylonian captivity, and the joy, the happiness, the elation that they would feel. How would you describe that if you were going to prophesy what's going to happen? How would you create the jubilation in the heart of the person who reads this and knows what is going to take place by the word pictures? Well, look here at verse 13 of Isaiah 49 and listen to what we have at the return from captivity. Verse 13, shout for joy, O heavens, and rejoice, O earth. Break forth into joyful shouting, O mountains, for the Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on his afflicted. The picture here is that of joy, and it's not that the mountains are really actually going to be doing anything. It is the picture of joy. Go back to chapter 40. In chapter 40, in verses 3 and 4, chapter 40, verses 3 and 4, we have the picture of the coming of the Messiah and what's going to happen here. The Lord is going to clear the way. In other words, there won't be anything hindering the coming of the Messiah. God will send the predecessor, John the Baptist. He will prepare the way of the Lord, and the Lord will come. The whole picture is that of a royal procession, and making that procession's progress just as easy and as unhindered as possible. So look at verses 3 and 4 here of Isaiah chapter 40. A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. That is fulfilled in John the Baptist coming and in everything God does to get the pathway clear for his Messiah. He says in verse 4, let every valley be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low, let the rough ground become a plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley. And then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. This is fulfilled in the New Testament. Look at the beginning of the Gospels. In fact, we have quotations in Matthew chapter 3, in verse 3. We see this in Mark 1 and verse 3. In Luke chapter 3, we have here the picture of the coming of Jesus. But when were the valleys literally lifted up? When were the mountains literally bulldozed and made low? That's not the point. The point is not that that's literally going to happen. Do you realize that there are PhDs out there in the religious world who say that this was not completely fulfilled in the first century, that it still has to be fulfilled, and we know that because the valleys weren't lifted up and the mountains weren't made low? Really? Is that really what you get out of the prophecy? The point, please see the point. It's imagery to depict this idea of making the way smooth and seeing to it that there are no hindrances in the coming of the Lord. You know, the same thing happens when we go back to a prophecy made by Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 4, we have a prophecy that, you know, it's a pretty popular prophecy today. People say that, a lot of people say that this is a prophecy that still has to be fulfilled. It says, Zechariah 14:4, in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, the Messiah, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountain will move toward the north, the other half toward the south. And we're told, well, that didn't happen in the days of Jesus. So Jesus is going to come back again, and that's where he's going to return. And as soon as his foot touches the top of the Mount of Olives, the mountain will be split. Really? Is that what you get out of that passage? The point is that when the Messiah came the first time, a way would be provided. You know, the mountains weren't made low and the valleys lifted up with regard to John the Baptist preparing the way of Jesus. The point was, clear the way. And that's exactly what we have here in Zechariah 14. make the way unhindered. The gospel will have progress that is not hindered. You know, even when the persecutions arose in Acts chapter 8, was there any hindrance? It was like hitting a hornet's nest. They just flew everywhere. And that's what we're seeing in the depiction of the Mount of Olives. A way is cleared and the gospel will go forth. You know, in Amos chapter 4 and verse 1, Amos offers a prophecy, and he talks about the cows of Bashan in his day. And he wasn't talking about literal cows, by the way. He was talking about the rich. And when he offers that statement there, the point is that the rich are feeding on the poor, and it's like a cow grazing. And this is what prophecy does. It takes imagery and it transports it in such a way that it creates this rich, wonderful, vibrant experience for the reader to get a feel. He may not know all of the details of how it's going to come about, but he gets a feel for what's really going to happen in the fulfillment of those prophecies. I hope this has been of some benefit. It helps us realize that when we come to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 27 and 28, we see the closing words there of how these things are going to be fulfilled, that we have to take the imagery of the vision and we have to allow it to have its fulfillment so that we can truly understand what God did in fact have in mind when he gave the vision to Daniel and offered this interpretation.